One of the reasons that old school RuneScape is doing so great is it had the chance to learn from RuneScape 3 as it selectively implemented the updates that players liked while leaving the more unfavorable ones out. It's almost like a filter where RS3 has to keep all of its updates whether they're good or bad, while Old School is a concentrated mix of RuneScape 3's best updates and its own great ideas, which is pretty neat as Old School hasn't had to deal with the loss of its own wilderness or the uncontrollable inflation that plagued RS3. This was and still is somewhat bad because of things like CoinShare, which if you played on or before 2013, you know what this is. Essentially, there was this item splitting system that could be activated in clan chat, and it could only be activated in select worlds. And if you were on one of these worlds with CoinShare activated and were with at least one other person that also had CoinShare activated and received a drop, that drop would then be split up in coins based on the Grand Exchange market value, and that's what players would receive. So now think about all the divine sigils worth around 500 mil being dropped. 500 mil introduced into the game within seconds. Now think about all the other sigils. And not even just that, imagine all the people killing next for items worth well over 200 mil that would drop at 20 times the rate of any sigil. What makes this all worse is when players would prefer to CoinShare because the amount of coins received for most drops would be worth more than it actually was on the Grand Exchange, which meant that less of that item was coming into the game, meaning the price of the item would only gradually decrease. This was a horrible solution to item splitting that, while initially sounded amazing because you could get your split instantly without having to worry about players scamming you and keeping the items for themselves, but would have dire consequences that would scar the RS3 economy. And this wasn't around for only a month or two. This system was in place for over 6 years before it was changed. Now instead of coins, shards are dropped that can be used to assemble items, but still that's 6 years of gold accumulating and items being kept from the game. So when the system was finally removed, which was the same year Old School was introduced, we saw the price of items drop steeply because they couldn't be turned into gold anymore, and also because of the people selling their RS3 gold in exchange for Old School gold. So the actual item value decreased while the amount of gold in game still remained high, which is why there's such a big gap between the exchange rates for gold between games, with it being 1 Old School GP for 45 RuneScape 3 GP. And of course, it's not solely because of CoinShare, but that RS3's banks have been around since 2001, so that's 17 years of gold accumulating from items being alked, while Old School only has 5 years under its belt. A better way to compare the two would be by using bonds, as they have the same use in each game, as an RS3 bond can be used for Old School membership and vice versa. So I'll be using this metric to compare the two games. And a key note I want to hit on is the low amount of high value drops that RS3 actually has, as most bosses, especially the older ones, as they were designed for a different combat system and suffer from power creep, so they feel like an unchallenging farm fest. Even the newer post-EOC bosses, while they do bring a lot to the table in terms of entertainment and varieties of ways to approach them, still lack high risk for high reward. It's only when you hit the endgame bosses, which require some extreme dedication and skill to learn, is when you start getting those drops. And it could be just me, but I don't like to boss just for a consistent amount of money. I'd like there to be a chance, however small, for me to strike it rich. I mean, come on, it's exciting when you see that Dragon Warhammer or Elysian Sigil on the ground after grinding the Corporal Beast out for literal days. And I'm not saying all items or bosses are equal. I'm not trying to compare something like Bandos Tacits, which is worth 1.6 mil in RS3 and 29.6 mil in Old School, which is 1/10 of a bond versus 8 bonds. I've seen people make arguments like these in the past when discussing the two games, and all I can say about comparing these items directly is not only is it ridiculous, but it's a horrible comparison, because Bandos Tacits and RS3 are worthless, and consider low tier gear as there is much better gear out there due to the game's ever increasing tiers of armor, while in Old School, Bandos Tacits are best in class melee gear. What I am comparing is the amount of work put in for said reward. So think about RS3 Tormented Demons. They're pretty fun to kill as they require you to constantly switch between different weapons and prayers throughout the fight. Sound familiar? Well, it should. These are Old School demonic gorillas, and like I mentioned before, this is one of the updates that the Old School team selectively implemented. So these are arguably as hard to kill in Old School as they are in RS3, and I should know as I have a significant kill count on both. And while they are nearly identical, there's something big that sets them apart. Something big that I also previously mentioned. Its rare drop table. Demonic Gorillas drop Zanite shards, which in turn can buy you 3 bonds, while a dragon limb from a tormented demon can only get you around 1/4 of a bond. So for the same amount of effort, I'd rather get a valuable drop from Oldschool than RS3. But this is just one example. On screen, you can see which boss drops on RS3 can buy you a bond, as well as those on Oldschool. And forgive me because there are so many, I might have missed a few. What I'm trying to get at is Oldschool has a large variety of bosses you can kill, and although some might not be initially profitable, the majority of them can make you bank on a unique drop. This is something that RS3 needs more of, but what it does have is the ability to keep churning out new content because of its ability-based combat system and its established power creep. So yeah, while the evolution of combat might have driven some players away, it gave RuneScape 3 a longer lifespan. It can keep adding new abilities, new prayers, weapon tiers, and levels, and in all, the community seems happy because they're getting new content. The possibilities seem endless, and it feels like they can really never run out of new things to add. But while this certainly helps the longevity of the game, it does it at the cost of killing its old content. Or it might not, and that's because of the invention skill. And trust me, this skill is amazing, and I didn't realize the reason for its implementation until I began training it. What Invention does is it allows you to break apart nearly any item for its components that can be used for perks, weapons, or maybe a helpful tool. In short, its significance is not only is it the biggest item sink in game, but also the biggest gold sink, so it directly combats inflation. And the way it does it is, let's say a new amazing perk is released and everyone wants this perk, but it requires 10 Bandosian components. Okay, so war shields are relatively cheap, so you break those down, but then they go up in price because there's fewer in game now and they're in demand. So then you move on to breaking down hilts, and eventually every Bandos item is worth at least 2 mils, so now it's worth it to go kill General Grador again. And this is exactly what happened with the addition of the Luck of the Dwarves ring. This ring requires 50 fortunate components to make, which is equivalent to 50 clue scroll rewards. So within a week, thousands upon thousands of clue scroll items were destroyed to make these rings, in turn making clue hunting profitable again. Now let's talk about the gold sink it also provides. While it doesn't really take gold out of the game, it does prevent it from entering. So instead of allocating all those magic longbows for a massive cash stack like you would in Oldschool, why not just break it down for strong components? And I have to say, this is a really creative way to solve somewhat of a complex issue, and I praise the RS3 team for coming up with it. In fact, it's so great that it's something that worries me deeply about Oldschool. And I want to make it clear, I'm not suggesting something like Invention should be implemented or anything should be changed. I'm just here to show you the situation that the game is in. And I feel that the community is very aware of it, as some people advocate for change or additions to new gear to have more variety, but others are against it because it would devalue existing items or would bring in change that could change the game in unintended ways. Because right now, things are pretty great. New people are joining and buying out items at the rate that they seem to be coming in. But what about 5 or 10 years from now? Will Zammy be faster to kill because of better weaponry or spells? Will it be farmed at the same speed you can farm in RS3? And that's something to worry about, because right now there's nothing removing these items from the game, and as the amount of items start increasing, the prices of items will also drop. And while Oldschool has great ways to combat the inflation of gold, like the newly introduced stake tax, it doesn't have a way to combat the inflation of items, besides the ones that are already at a high value, of course. But then again, this is real world economics on a game, so just take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. So while Oldschool doesn't have the invention skill, it does have things to make activities viable. Take Zoro for example. This boss will probably always be profitable because of the skills it requires to operate the toxic blowpipe and the serpentine visage. And if the price of scales get too high, you can always break down one of its weapons for its scales, which also combats inflation. The Theater of Blood also does this with its new weaponry because of Vials of Blood, which can be used to make potions and charge the theater's most valuable item, the Scythe of Vitor. So although inflation may or may not lower the price of an item, it's okay because the activity it gets its charges from will be worth doing solely to charge its weaponry. And I'm not advocating for it, but it might be okay to add a new best in slot item if it meant it was higher maintenance, or if it utilized a previous tier of item to make. So think about the Abyssal Tentacle. It removes an Abyssal Whip from the game for 10,000 charges of a tier 75 weapon. And from what I can tell, it's kind of a compromise for those against change and those for it, because it gives those that want a new tier of item what they want while also retaining the value of older items. So these could be a solution if inflation does in fact get really bad where all the items start dropping. I mean, unless you're an Iron Man, because at that point it doesn't matter, but you know what I mean. So yeah, just please take everything with a grain of salt because this is mostly real world economics applied to a game when RuneScape may not work that way. Anyway, this has been Inflation, RuneScape 3 versus Oldschool. Thanks for watching.